Hello, everybody. This panel will be a little bit different than the previous one because basically we will have a keynote lecture by Mr. Carl Anderson. For the last 21 years, he headed one of the most important and influential Catholic organizations in the world, namely the Supreme Knights of Columbus. He was the Supreme Knight of the Knights of Columbus. He also has ample experience in working in the state administration. He worked for Ronald Reagan in 1980s. He also has an experience of participating in the life of the hierarchy church because he was a member or a consultant of 4 papal councils. He is also an author of books. One of them was translated into Polish, Civilization of Love, that's the title. But for many years, Carl Anderson was also a direct witness to John Paul II's mission and activity. He was watching John Paul II closely. So, we will now hear from Carl Anderson. He will talk about the vision of John Paul II for the future, or for our future. And after this lecture, we will have a brief discussion. So over to you, sir, Carl Anderson.
Well, thank you very much. Dziękuję. Last trip to Poland in 2002, Pope John Paul II said, "I am grateful for this invitation to visit my Krakow and for the hospitality you have given me." Then in 2006, when Pope Benedict XVI visited Krakow, he made these words of his predecessor his own, and then he added this: "Krakow has a special place in the hearts of countless Christians throughout the world who know that John Paul II came to the Vatican Hill from this city on the Wawel Hill, from a far country, which thus became a country dear to all of us." So with these words of Pope Benedict, they are especially meaningful to me today, and I am so honored to participate in this historic conference, in this historic venue. This month marks the 45th anniversary of the election of Karol Wojtyła as a successor of St. Peter, and the beginning of what is perhaps the most remarkable pontificate in the history of the Catholic Church since St. Peter's pontificate. So where to begin in assessing the vision of this great Pope, his legacy and his leadership? At the conclusion of the 4 quartets, T.S. Eliot wrote this: "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." So let us take up T.S. Eliot's method and consider this great exploring Pope by returning to the beginning of his pontificate. After all these years, let us return to where he started in order to know him, well, if not for the first time, at least to know him better. On the day of John Paul II's inaugural Mass, the scripture reading included the words of St. Peter, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Nothing very surprising that the successor of St. Peter would begin his ministry repeating St. Peter's proclamation of Christ as the Messiah. But he proclaims them with the angelic salutation addressed to the Blessed Virgin Mary and then later to St. Joseph: "Do not be afraid." So nearly 2,000 years after Christianity, the Pope warns us not to be afraid. but not to be afraid of what? Those words of St. Peter, which virtually every Catholic knows and has heard so often, have become in a way routine and commonplace. And after 2,000 years of Christianity, what reason could there be to be afraid of hearing again St. Peter's declaration? St. John Paul II will explain the radical meaning he gives to this proclamation and its consequence for the entirety of his pontificate. John Paul II begins, "These words first of all." Now, 45 years later, we would say about him, "These words first, last, always, and everywhere, to the ends of the earth and to the ends of his earthly ministry." St. John Paul II begins his pontificate with the proclamation that Jesus is truly the Christ, the Son of the living God, and then the consequence of this proclamation: open wide the doors for Christ to his saving power, open the boundaries of states, economic and political systems, the vast fields of culture, civilization, and development. Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. Certainly, John Paul II was thinking about Poland. That would soon be made very clear. During the next 27 years, it would be clear that he was also thinking about each of the 129 countries he would personally visit. He would exclude no one from this mission to let Christ speak to man, for Christ alone has the words of life. And it was the Pope's mission that Christ's words of life may reach all people. In the West, it was easy to see John Paul II's statement to open wide the doors for Christ as a call for religious freedom in countries where communist regimes had slammed shut the doors of society to Christianity. But he was not only thinking of liberty and religious liberty. He was thinking about liberty and its relation to the truth. Christ alone knows what is true about man. With the angelic salutation, "Do not be afraid," he announced a new evangelical engagement with societies around the world based on a Christian anthropology in which anthropology and Christology are inseparably connected. This Christological anthropology provides the coherent frame of reference for the Pope's mission, and his inaugural homily is the foretaste of what would come throughout his pontificate. 2 months after telling the world not to be afraid of Christ, John Paul II announced he would travel to Mexico. And 1 month later, he was in Mexico, praying before the miraculous image of Our Lady of Guadalupe. As a starting point for a new global evangelization, Mexico was an inspired choice. A devoutly Catholic country, Mexico had earlier in the century suffered a great persecution of the Catholic Church, which had resulted in thousands of refugees fleeing into the United States, the destruction of numerous churches and Catholic institutions, the killing of nearly 100 priests and countless laymen. In 1978, the Catholic Church continued to suffer dreadful, serious deprivations of civil liberties in Mexico. And the Pope's challenge to open wide the doors for Christ could not be missed by that country's political leaders of the Revolutionary Party that had governed the country for more than half a century. Now, many observers considered the Pope's visit to Our Lady of Guadalupe's shrine as routine because of his devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. But it was much more than that. It was a key to understanding his entire global ministry in 2 important ways. First, the mestiza face of Our Lady of Guadalupe was, as John Paul II would later write, an impressive example of a perfectly enculturated evangelization. John Paul II would not seek to evangelize from the outside, as if Christianity were some type of European export. His proposal for a new evangelization would be an enculturated evangelization. And second, for those who were paying attention, Our Lady of Guadalupe symbolized what John Paul II meant when he spoke of opening wide the doors for Christ. He was not seeking to impose something from the outside. Christianity had already been formative of Mexican culture for nearly 5 centuries. Christ was already within this culture, and it was the secularists in the Mexican government who were seeking to drive him out. It was a theme he would take up, of course, in Warsaw's Victory Square. The most dramatic demonstration of this theme came not in Mexico City on his visit to Mexico, but among the indigenous tribes from the poorest regions of Mexico, Oaxaca and Chiapas, at a village called Quilapan. John Paul II declared he would be the voice of those who cannot speak or who have been silenced. He insisted, the worker who with his sweat waters with his affliction cannot wait any longer for full and effective recognition of his dignity. He has a right to be respected. He has a right to have access to the development which his dignity as a man deserves. It is necessary to carry out bold changes. Opening wide the doors for Christ meant seeing Christ in the indigenous and building a society that respects the dignity of those on the margins. And 4 months to the day he left Mexico, John Paul II arrived in Warsaw to begin 9 days that would change the world. Now, much has been written about this pilgrimage, but I want to emphasize these words from his homily in Victory Square. To Poland, the Church brought Christ, the key to understanding that great and fundamental reality that is man. For man cannot be fully understood without Christ. He cannot understand who he is, nor what his true dignity is, nor what his vocation is, nor what his final end is. He cannot understand any of this without Christ. Therefore, the Pope continued, Christ cannot be kept out of the history of man in any part of the globe, at any longitude or latitude or geography. The exclusion of Christ from the history of man, he concluded, is an act against man. Without Christ, it is impossible to understand the history of Poland. Now, for a Marxist regime and a Marxist ideology based on the exclusion of the false consciousness, according to them, of Christianity as the precondition of progress, it is difficult to imagine a greater challenge to that regime than what John Paul II said that day in Warsaw. The Pope had taken aim at the center of Marxist theory, but not in a theoretical or abstract way. It was a challenge arising from the actual historical experience of the people of Poland. Many in the West were astounded that the Pope had declared a new Ostpolitik, but the mistake was to think that what he said was limited to Poland and the nations behind the Iron Curtain. In other words, that the Pope was only talking about Ostpolitik. His words apply with equal force to the secularized liberal democracies of the West that have sought in one way or another to marginalize and privatize Christianity, and indeed all religion. Democracies in which it has become normative to disregard Christianity. 4 months after his triumphant pilgrimage to Poland, John Paul II would again cross the Atlantic for the first of his pastoral visits to the United States. and on the way he would stop in Ireland for a message that would change the course of history in that country. Throughout 1979, Northern Ireland had witnessed horrific sectarian violence. Just weeks before the Pope's arrival, the Provisional IRA had killed 18 British soldiers in Northern Ireland. And on the same day, a bomb killed the 79-year-old Lord Mountbatten and his grandson. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher had warned that Northern Ireland was in danger of becoming another Balkans. Distrust, mounting to hatred and revenge, is never far beneath the political surface, she said, and those who step onto this surface must do so gingerly. Pope John Paul II was about to do just that, but not so gingerly. The Pope had considered going to Northern Ireland. He had been invited there, but now with the violence, that had become impossible. So instead, the Pope chose the coastal town of Drogheda, close to Northern Ireland. Drogheda was the site seared into the memory of Irish Catholics. There in 1649, Oliver Cromwell's troops had committed the bloodiest massacre of Catholics in Irish history. Thousands had been killed. And there, in 1979, John Paul II came to preach reconciliation and forgiveness. If his impassioned address in Mexico and Quilipan and in Warsaw had been historic, his homily in Drogheda was equally so, and it was followed by 14 minutes of uninterrupted applause. Christianity does not commit us to close our eyes to difficult human problems, he declared. But what Christianity does forbid is to seek solutions to these situations by the ways of hatred, by the murdering of defenseless people, by the methods of terrorism. He continued, "The message I affirmed in Mexico and in Poland, I reaffirm today in Ireland. Every human being has inalienable rights that must be respected. The moral law, the guardian of human rights, protector of the dignity of man, cannot be set aside by any person or group or by the state itself for any cause, not even for the security or in the interests of law and order." Then he went on to talk about violence, and he called the youth of Ireland to turn away from violence, to turn away from hatred, and instead to work for peace. And that's what resulted in the 14-minute applause. Now, it would still be years before the Downing Street Declaration and the Good Friday Agreement, but John Paul II had set a tipping point and altered the national Irish consciousness. Endless violence in Ireland was no longer an inevitable political reality. Protestants in Northern Ireland, hearing the Pope's passionate condemnation of violence, now knew that their suspicions that the Catholic Church was somehow secretly supporting terrorism were unfounded. And the dramatic response of Catholics also sent a message. Decades earlier, Mao Zedong had said the guerrilla fighter moves through the civilian population like a fish swims in the ocean. By their applause, Catholics in Ireland had announced that the ocean was drying up for terrorism. In Poland, John Paul II had promoted a new solidarity, what Joseph Tischner described as a solidarity of awakened consciences. He had now done something very similar in Ireland. And having made that homily, he boarded a plane for the United States and arrived later that day in Boston, where he celebrated a mass for more than 2 million Catholics, the largest religious gathering in the history of the United States. What awaited him in the United States was in some ways even more unexpected than what had happened in Mexico, Poland, and Ireland. For generations, Catholics in the U.S. had been an unpopular minority, caught between the cultural millstones of Protestantism and secularism. And like many Catholics in Western Europe, Catholics in the United States had been shocked by the reaction to Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae. But in the United States, Protestants and secularists came together in their denunciation of the Pope. Even today, it is difficult to imagine the tsunami of protest that greeted the Pope's encyclical. In the decade that followed, Pope Paul VI was seen increasingly as frail, isolated, and elderly, a shepherd out of touch with his flock and leading an institution in disarray. The primary reason for John Paul II's trip to the United States was to address the United Nations. And on October 2nd, he flew from Boston to New York to address the UN for approximately an hour. We talked about human rights, but he also talked about safeguarding the objective rights of the spirit, of human conscience, and of human creativity, including protecting man's relationship with God. But the Pope's last stop in the United States was Washington, D.C., where he met privately at the White House with President Jimmy Carter. And Carter had been very gracious, saying, "You have moved among us as a champion of dignity and decency for every human being, and as a pilgrim for peace among nations, you have offered us your love, and we as individuals are heartened by it. You can be sure, Pope John Paul, that the people of America return your love." Then from the White House, the Pope went to the Washington Mall to celebrate Mass. Now, since the 17th century, Catholics in the United States had coexisted with a persistent form of anti-Catholicism, which historian Philip Jenkins has described as the last acceptable prejudice in America. And what fueled that prejudice was a firm conviction held by both Protestants and secularists that Catholics, and especially the Pope, should be denied political influence or power. And John Paul II had just addressed the world's governments at the United Nations, and now on the Mall in Washington, he would change how Catholics in America viewed their Pope and how Catholics viewed their responsibilities as citizens. He did so by entering the public debate on one of the nation's most divisive issues, the issue of abortion. He said, "I do not hesitate to proclaim before you and the world that all human life, from the moment of conception and through all subsequent stages, is sacred because human life is created in the image and likeness of God. Nothing surpasses the greatness or dignity of a human being." And so he continued, "We will stand up every time that human life is threatened. When the sacredness of life before birth is attacked, we will stand up and proclaim that no one ever has the authority to destroy unborn life." Americans have been challenged to build what he would later describe as a culture of life and a civilization of love. And if before John Paul II came to the United States, the papacy appeared in disarray, after his visit, that was no longer the case. Time magazine placed the photograph of the Pope on its cover with the headline, "John Paul Superstar." In less than a week, John Paul II had not only restored the image of the Pope, he had brought a new unity among millions of Catholics with their Pope, and he had energized Catholics in the pro-life movement in America. Within a year of his election, John Paul II had shown the world what he meant when he said, "Open wide the doors for Christ," in the fields of economics, politics, and culture. He had championed social justice for the marginalized in the third world. He had advocated religious liberty and human rights for those suffering totalitarian oppression. He had promoted a new reconciliation to overcome the centuries-old divisions within Christianity. He had sought nonviolence and condemned terrorism. He had outlined a global human rights agenda among the world's diplomats. He had energized the pro-life movement, and he had found a new voice for Catholicism within the public debate of secular, liberal democracies. All of this deriving from that first homily, repeating St. Peter's proclamation that you are the Christ. In promulgating the Catechism of the Catholic Church, John Paul II wrote, "Vatican II has always been, and especially during these years of my pontificate, the constant reference point of my every pastoral action." The most important reference point of the Council for Pastoral Action was the Pastoral Constitution on the Church in the Modern World, Gaudium et Spes, and especially for John Paul II, number 22. The truth is that only the mystery of the incarnate Word does the mystery of man take on light. Christ fully reveals man to man himself and makes his supreme calling clear. This Christocentric anthropology is foundational to both the pastoral approach of the Second Vatican Council and also the pontifical approach of John Paul II. This Christocentric anthropology was highlighted during his first pilgrimage to Poland, during a visit that is not so often discussed today, his visit to Auschwitz. And what he said on that occasion offers, I think, a most important way of understanding his pontificate and his leadership, his legacy, and his vision for the future. There, John Paul II said, "Can anyone on this earth be surprised that a pope who came from the archdiocese that contains this camp started his first encyclical with the words Redemptor Hominis, Redemptor Hominis, and that he devoted," the Pope continued, "it in full, it devoted his encyclical in full to the cause of man, the dignity of man, the threats facing man, the rights of man." The Pope's address at Auschwitz is exceptional, even among the many exceptional speeches he gave on that 1979 pilgrimage to Poland. The homily, obviously, is filled with personal emotion. In reading those words at the place which has come to symbolize the crucifixion of man, we can see that this man, Karol Wojtyła, was a man of this crucifixion, right? Not in an abstract way, not in an abstract way, but in a personal way. Day after day, he lived in this crucible of suffering, right? And then year after year, he lived in the nightmare of communist totalitarianism, right? So looking at his visit to Auschwitz, we can see his words are more than a dramatic moment in a dramatic pilgrimage and in a dramatic papacy. They reveal Karol Wojtyła, the man, the philosopher, the priest, the Pope. "I have come," he said, "to this Golgotha of the modern world," when he continued, 6 million Poles lost their lives here during this war. a fifth of the nation, yet another stage in the centuries-old fight of this nation, my nation, for its fundamental rights among the peoples of Europe, yet another painful reckoning with the conscience of mankind. Now, the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine recalls more than any other event in Europe since the Second World War the suffering that occurred in this region of the world during the tyrannies of Hitler and Stalin. Between the end of the First World War and the end of the Second World War, the world experienced global warfare in which more than 70 million persons died. And when we include those who died in Ukraine during the great Stalinist terror famine of the Holodomor, there were more people killed in Poland and Ukraine than anywhere else in Europe during the Second World War, or for that matter, more than any other place in the world at any other time in history. Historian Timothy Snyder has recounted this history of the deliberate and appalling genocidal killing of people between Berlin and Moscow under the title Bloodlands. The details of this appalling mass murder of more than 14 million people is so wrenching that one keeps telling oneself that it could not possibly happen again. And yet the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with its systematic targeting of civilians, the destruction of non-military infrastructures, demonstrates that the Bloodlands are not only a memory, they again can be a terrible reality. The war, I think, brings a new urgency to the message of John Paul II at Auschwitz. Facing the reality of Auschwitz, John Paul II goes to the root cause of the crisis, beyond nationalism, beyond racism, beyond ideology. In his address, the Pope references his first encyclical, Redemptor Hominis, and the anthropology of love that radiates through that document. Man cannot live without love, he writes. He remains a being that is incomprehensible to himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not encounter love, if he does not experience it and make it his own, if he does not participate intimately in it. Later, in his second encyclical, Divus in Misericordia, he develops this Christian anthropology. He writes, "It is God who is rich in mercy, whom Jesus Christ reveals. Then John Paul II outlines how mercy becomes the foundation of the civilization of love. And if there is to be a culture war between this civilization and others, how Christians ought to engage in it. He writes, this authentically evangelical process is not just a spiritual transformation realized once and for all. It is a whole lifestyle, an essential and continuous characteristic of the Christian vocation. It consists in the constant discovery and persevering practice of love as a unifying and elevating power. For John Paul II, this Christocentric anthropology is not proposed as an inspirational theological ideal to promote some greater public service, and nor is it a way of instrumentalizing Christianity to support public policies to bring about a change in society. It is proposed, especially when you hear him talk in Auschwitz, it is proposed as a Christian form of realpolitik, necessary to avoid a repeat of modernity's great tragedy. John Paul II proposed a culture of life and a civilization of love and a Christological anthropology foundational to it as a unifying and elevating power for the rebuilding of society. In the American context, one thinks of the extent to which secularism has displaced the role of Christianity in just this dimension, that is, the ability to influence public life. The militantly atheist American philosopher Richard Rorty articulates this trend when he writes of Americans who hope, quote, to separate the fraternity and loving kindness urged by the Christian scriptures from the idea of its supernatural parentage. And especially of those Americans who, he observes, take pride in what America might, all by itself and by its own light, make of itself, rather than America's obedience to any authority, including the authority of God. And toward the end of his life, Rorty explained to Jürgen Habermas his hope that someday my remote descendants, he said, will live in a global civilization in which love is pretty much the only law. The problem here, seems to me, is what psychologists might describe as defensive hope. That is, an unrealistic defense mechanism to defend against having to face a disappointing reality about someone or something we love. There simply is very little evidence to suggest that Christian virtues and values such as brotherly love and loving kindness can be sustained in a society that has severed them from what Rorty calls their supernatural parentage. Nor can we find any evidence that the great atheist regimes of the 20th century came anywhere close to a civilization in which we could conclude that, quote, love is pretty much the only law. Psychologists recognize that it requires courage to move beyond the illusions and false sense of security that accompanies the psychological condition of defensive hope. In such a situation, a therapist might decide that the road to recovery begins with 4 simple words. Be not afraid. That's 3 words. Do not be afraid. That's 4. Leadership for the future not only should be understood within the context of a leader's vision for the future. I have suggested that John Paul II's vision for the future was clearly articulated during the first year of his pontificate, as was the anthropology underlying it. I would like to conclude with a quotation from Max Weber, not from his famous Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, but from a 1919 lecture he gave on the subject of leadership. He said, "It is immensely moving when a mature man, no matter whether old or young in years, is aware of a responsibility for the consequences of his conduct and really feels such responsibility with heart and soul. He then acts by following an ethic of responsibility, and somewhere he reaches a point where he has to say, 'Here I stand, I can do no other.' And that is something genuinely human and moving, and every one of us who is not spiritually dead must realize the possibility of finding himself at some time in that position. Insofar as this is true, an ultimate ethic of ends and an ethic of responsibility can join in unison to constitute a genuine person. John Paul II is precisely this mature, genuine person, not on 1 or 2 occasions, but throughout his papacy and his life. And we are accustomed to describing John Paul II as one of the great leaders in the history of the Catholic Church. But instead, I think in this conference, we have considered the possibility that rather we should think of him as one of the great leaders in the history of the world. a world leader, but with a profound difference, a mature and genuine man who devoted his life to realizing the immense implications of Peter's proclamation that Jesus is the Christ. The historic opening words of his papal ministry, "Open wide the doors for Christ," was John Paul II's way of beginning a dialogue with the world about how that proclamation changes everything. Do not be afraid. Open wide the doors for Christ. These words were not written days earlier for a homily in St. Peter's Square. They had been written years earlier in the quietness of Carol Wojtyła's own heart, and the writing there had made all the difference. Every religious community encourages a distinctive spiritual character and moral way of life. During the last century, Poland experienced an extraordinary spiritual revival, reflected in the lives of saints such as Maximilian Kolbe, Faustina Kowalska, Albert Szymilowski, John Paul II, as well as the countless Polish martyrs and witnesses to the faith, such as the recently beatified Uma family. But these saints did not live in isolation. They were part of a religious people. We may even say a Christian people with a distinctly Christian character, both moral and spiritual. A Christian people for whom self-sacrifice, mercy, and charity were formative and deeply rooted in their sense of community, a sense of community that made possible the spiritual and moral triumph over the evils which they endured during more than half of the 20th century. That distinctive character made possible the national response to John Paul II's 1979 pilgrimage to Poland, which gave life to the Solidarity movement and which laid an important foundation for what John Paul II would later call the civilization of love. This character is today reflected in the extraordinary response of the people of Poland to the refugee crisis resulting from the horrific Russian invasion of Ukraine. And these people today, in so many ways distinctive within the Catholic tradition of Europe, are these people capable of reintroducing into Europe a new discourse concerning Christianity? In Ecclesia in Europa, John Paul II spoke of the need for Christians in Europe to engage in a charity that evangelizes. So the question arises, are Slavic Christians who for centuries have found in Christianity a unifying and elevating principle for their culture and their nations, able to reintroduce Christianity in the postmodern, post-liberal society of Europe through a Christian experience of mercy and charity? I began these remarks with a reference to John Paul II's last visit to Poland, and I will conclude with a quote from his final address at the airport here in Krakow. I hope that Poland, which has belonged to Europe for centuries, will find its proper place in the structures of the European community. Not only will it not lose its own identity, but it will enrich the continent and the world with its tradition. Thank you very much.
Dziękujemy za ten wspaniały wykład.
Thank you for this fantastic lecture.
Te historie, o których Pan
Well, the
opowiadał,
histories you've described were also related to the pontificate of John Paul II and the presidential term of Ronald Reagan. You were privileged enough to be able to watch these relations rather closely. You were the part of Ronald Reagan's administration. Pola Dobrianski mentioned that as well, I mean the relations between President Reagan and John Paul II. Would you be able to share some personal testimony from back of these times? What were these relations like? And they changed the face of the world, didn't they?
Well, I didn't have as much experience as Paula did, Ambassador Dobrianski, with foreign policy, but I did, for several years, work with religious communities. And in fact, one of my first events was Nations Week signing of the declaration, which President Reagan signed at the Ukrainian National Shrine in Washington, D.C. back in about 1985. So things are all sort of coming back together. I think one of the real important aspects of the friendship between John Paul II and Ronald Reagan had to do with the attempted assassination of both of them. And of course, St. John Paul II famously said, one finger pulled the trigger and another finger guided the bullet. And President Reagan had never expressed it quite in that fashion, but had the same sense that his life had been saved for a higher purpose, and he was devoting what remained of his life not to his re-election several years later, but to this higher purpose. They were both strong believers, obviously, in God, and that motivated a very strong, I think, bond between the two of them. And, you know, President Reagan, his father was Catholic, was a member of the Knights of Columbus. His mother was Protestant. He was raised as a very religious person. And that motivated. And I think that's what cemented the bond between the two of them. And I think that's a good part of the story, why they felt. Reagan also, as a young man, had been a lifeguard on a river in Illinois called the Rock River. And when he retired from the presidency, he had a picture of the Rock River in his office. And even when his Alzheimer's was rather advanced and people only, you know, very good friends would come to see him in his office, and sometimes he would kind of slip away in the conversation. He would come back and point to the photograph, and he would say, you know, I rescued 70 people from that river. So Reagan had a vision, an identity of caring for others, sacrifice, willing to be sacrificed, right? Because a lifeguard sometimes puts his life in danger to rescue somebody, the other person. And so I think Reagan had a inbuilt sense of solidarity, which then naturally kind of came to the fore with John Paul II in Poland. So I guess that would be my observation. I'm sorry, I'm beginning to get a little bit of a cold, and I think you can kind of hear that.
Okej. Pytałem o przeszłość, o
Right. So I was asking you about these historic times, about the time of Ronald Reagan, but let me now fast forward to the future. I just read recently this analysis by a theologian from the West who compared the history of the Catholic Church to a stream, to a river stream. And he says, if we fast forward to the future 100 years and then we look back at our present times, he says, we will view the pontificates of John Paul II and Benedict XVI as two Don Quixotes who were trying to stop the stream and reverse the river, which you can't do. Some changes cannot be reversed. Some changes are so deep and so profound that there is no way you can actually walk the walk of what John Paul II and Benedict XVI were proclaiming. They're saying it's inevitable, says the theologian, the analyst. And he says, well, both popes should be respected, but we must realize that the Church will follow and flow in a different direction than they would want it to. So first of all, do you agree with this diagnosis, sir? And then second question, where would these opinions come from? I feel that more and more often these opinions are dominating, or such opinions tend to dominate Catholic debate as well, a Catholic discourse, not only in the secular world, but it seems that this is being a dominant narrative.
Well, where to begin? I think that, first of all, G.K. Chesterton once, about 100 years ago, said about St. Thomas More that Thomas More is more important today, in the 1920s, than he was at the time of his death, but he's not nearly as important as he will be 100 years from now, which is today. I think we'll find the same thing being said about St. John Paul II. That he is the Pope for the future. He is the Pope of the Second Vatican Council. I tried to show that with the whole question, and it's something theologians can discuss in more detail, but if you have the pastoral constitution, the pastoral mission of the Church in Gaudium et Spes, then you have a question of what is the anthropology. And if the question is what is the anthropology, it's number 22 and 24, which with number 24 reads into solidarity. You could do a theology of solidarity from Gaudium et Spes. So I think really, if the council is part of this process and not a looking backward, but is in fact the future for the Church, I think John Paul II truly is the Pope of the Second Vatican Council. Now, I think the problem here, and it's been a problem that's been going on for, at least in the United States, 50, 60 years. You can take many examples, but one example would be Harvey Cox's book in 1965, The Secular City, in which he argues that secularism is inevitable. It's a part of modernity and science, and therefore the Church must accommodate itself to secular society, stop using sacred vocabulary, start using a sort of a more material vocabulary and ways of presenting itself that secularists can understand better. This notion of the inevitability of secularism, which is what I think is underlying the comment about the Church as a stream that has to go forward, is really an assertion that the Church must accommodate itself to modernity and the Enlightenment assumptions, which are basically not Christian assumptions. I think it's like Caesar Augustus telling the early Church Fathers they must accommodate themselves to the Pax Romana. And the early Church was saying, no, because the Pax Romana is founded on a false understanding of man, a false understanding of his purpose and ultimate end, and therefore a false understanding of community, not to mention a false understanding of religion. So it would have been very easy in first century Rome to say, well, you know, this is a pretty successful operation here, and who are we to oppose it? Right? You can look around the modern world as a pretty successful operation, and who is the Church to oppose it? I think the Church opposes it in the way that I discussed, the way John Paul II presented it. It's a different understanding of man. And it's an understanding of, why do you seek justice? Why are you committed to equality? Why are you committed to liberty? It's because you love your neighbor, right? You love your neighbor. And I think the remarkable thing about John Paul II is just a little footnote, but it was referenced yesterday about his Jewish friend in the Catholic Church. You don't belong here. Well, doesn't she realize that we're all children of the same Father? We're all children of the same God. If you are proclaiming Christ as Messiah, you have to have a pretty good understanding and appreciation and respect for the Hebrew scriptures and tradition of which the Messiah is coming out of. So I think that it may at first blush seem as though a Christocentric anthropology is somewhat exclusionary. I think precisely the opposite is the case, and I think solidarity in Poland is a reflection of that in a very concrete, graspable.
Tu się chyba zgadzamy, że Jan Paweł II
I believe we agree that John Paul II has left a great intellectual and spiritual legacy. However, the question arises, who will now take up this work? Do you see communities, any communities nowadays which could take up and continue this legacy and heritage of John Paul II? So who in the church could now take up John Paul II's legacy?
You took a long time to say that. I think the people in this room. Part of the reason why I think I caught a cold, we spent some time in coal mines earlier this week, and we went to the museum at Wujek Mine, right? Which is, if you haven't seen this, is absolutely fantastic. When you see that, you're not dealing with great intellectuals. You're not dealing with great educated people. You're not dealing with diplomats and the elites of society. You're dealing with believers and men who are brothers. Because when you go down into that coal mine, you realize that there is an existential solidarity there, because you depend on the man next to you. And so I think John Paul II did what I think a true leader does. He inspires. He says, this is possible, and you have the ability to achieve it. And I think part of what we see in a democratic society is we have to remove notions that we have this hierarchical institution called the Catholic Church, which is going to solve our problems from a top-down methodology, when in fact democracies are evangelized horizontally. We can't just baptize the prince and then everybody follows suit. And evangelizing horizontally means the common Catholic families. And if there's a doubt that that type of Catholicism exists in Poland today, in Polish culture, look at how you don't have any refugee camps in Poland for the Ukrainians. And in fact, if you go back and look at the 20th century history between Ukraine and Poland, it hasn't been that exactly easy, right? Galicia and some other places, it was not a good time. So this idea of Catholic family, the Uma family, The Ulma family, right? Those people, they sacrificed their children to try to save these Jews. And they were not the only family. There were over 3,000 have been declared righteous at Yad Vashem for trying to save, right? Don't tell me those families don't continue to exist in Poland. They need some empowerment, and I think that's what John Paul II did. He didn't come and say, pass this law, promulgate that regulation. He inspired people with certain principles and the idea that what you do can matter, can make a difference, can change. And then he sort of let the laity do what they could. And you saw the results in Gdansk. You saw it in the miners' strike and other places, the intellectuals, the youth. And I think going through that museum, one of the things that really was phenomenal was you can see a very centralized totalitarian government losing its grip, losing control, because of this spontaneous, sort of unorganized network of people just realizing they can be free. And if they have Christian values, they can move forward on it. And, you know, the first several years after martial law, I mean, there was a certain amount of hopelessness in Poland, right? Is the situation as bad today as it was under martial law? So I think the other question, and then I'll stop, is, was this huge crucifixion in the 20th century for Slavic people and the great saints that are part of this period of history, was all of that so that Poland could just meekly join the European Union and begin to slide towards secularization? I don't know. I think some people would like us to believe that secularism is inevitable. And I think secularism, a better understanding of secularism is that it's been foisted, at least in the United States, has been foisted by a revolutionary, loose-knit network of activists that have gone on for 100 years in the United States, under the mythology that this is inevitable, so don't oppose it. And I don't think it's true. And I certainly don't think it's true in Poland.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for offering us all these answers and for your keynote speech. All of this is very moving. So I guess the apt conclusion of the Congress may begin by, first of all, thanking Karl Anderson with a warm round of applause. Thank you.